Greetings, dear chess fans and experts. This is FIDE Master Max Omariev with you, and today we're going to analyze two games in which Garry Kasparov destroyed the young Magnus Carlsen. These games were played in 2004, and there were only 3 games played between Garry Kasparov and Magnus Carlsen. You might be familiar with one of them. It's pretty famous. In that game, Magnus Carlsen had a sensational draw against Garry Kasparov. But the other 2 games were won by Garry Kasparov, so nobody even mentioned them because it was expected. By the way, Magnus Carlsen managed to beat Anatoly Karpov in that tournament. Now let's start to watch the first game from 2004 Reykjavik Rapid, which ended in 21 moves. Garry Kasparov managed to defeat the young Norwegian very confidently. So here we have the English opening, or more precisely, the hedgehog setup. After the move e4, Kasparov grabs space, plays rook c1 and queen e2, supposedly preventing the move b5. But Magnus was not stopped by the fact that Kasparov added a blow there, and he still plays b5. This is a very typical solution in such hedgehog structures. Black undermines white's pawn structure on the queen side, plus he tries to open up on the files for his rooks. Kasparov does not take the b5 pawn. He plays b4. Because if you take that pawn, then black wins it back on a2, and the b2 pawn hangs, so it's not a good solution. Kasparov plays b4. He wants to play c5, plus does not let Magnus's knight move to c5. Knight e5 is played by Magnus. cb. Now Kasparov decides to take the pawn. And here, for some reason, Magnus's brain glitched. He played queen b8. Instead of just taking the a2 pawn, winning back the pawn, he played queen b8 for some reason. However, here white also has a small advantage due to the passed pawn and 2 bishops. But the pawns are equal. Actually, there was a chance for a draw here. But queen b8 is just a pawn investment. Kasparov skillfully plays a4, and here he has an extra pawn, albeit a doubled one. He plays b6, and here Magnus makes just a decisive mistake. He plays knight g4. He should have played rook a4, and here's an approximate variation. White drops a pawn, plays b7 to invade on the 8th rank. The pawn should be taken, otherwise rook c8 and force exchange on the c8 square with promotion of the pawn to queen. So black captures the pawn. We invade on the 8th rank. Play bishop d2, defending b4. And here, white, due to this domination on the 8th rank, and the 2 bishops have a fairly large advantage, plus the b-pawn is a passed pawn. In general, black's position is not very good, but they can hold on there. There's still a lot of fighting, especially for the blitz, but Magnus plays knight g4. And now I recommend you to pause the video and find how Kasparov forced Magnus Carlsen to surrender. So, dear friend, I think you managed to find this solution, though you may have just peeked at it before in the notation here. But I hope that you solved it yourself. This is the move b7. We lure the rook to the b7 square. You can't go anywhere with the rook because otherwise rook c8 will follow. And here we just promote the pawn to queen. So the pawn needs to be taken, but in this case we play e5, we open up our bishop, and then we have this pin. And we end up gaining the exchange. There's about this position with an extra exchange for white. So after the move b7 in this position, Magnus Carlsen conceded defeat. And that's how Kasparov's first game with Magnus Carlsen ended. He simply destroyed him in 21 moves. Well, the second game was more interesting. Let's move on to it. It was played in the same chess tournament in Reykjavik. This tournament was unusual because it was held in the knockout format. Fate had it that Garry Kasparov and Magnus Carlsen met in the first round. Magnus got really lucky with pairing. Kasparov ended up beating him, of course, by the score of 1.5 to 0.5, but one of their games ended in a draw. In the end, not only did Kasparov beat Magnus, but he won the whole tournament. But now we're interested specifically in the game with Magnus. Let's take a look at it. Here we also have Kasparov opening up with c4, because this pawn brought him victory in the Blitz tournament. Now let's see what we had here. This time Magnus decided to change things up a bit and go for the King's Indian setup. He plays e5, Kasparov plays bishop e3. Not a very popular move. Castling is used more often in this case, but we don't go deep into the opening now. ed, knight d4, c6. Here's black's plan. They want to move the pawn to d5 and open up the e-file, and they want to make things clear in the center. Kasparov plays f3, strengthens the e4 pawn, and bishop f2, so the bishop after the move d5 won't hang here. Kasparov moves it away in advance. After d5, he has an opportunity to capture the d-pawn, which is exactly what we see. And now c5. We got such an interesting structure. The pawn on d5 is isolated. White reliably blocks it, and they're now planning an attack on the queen side. Play b4, then maybe a4, and so on. All in all, that's the structure we have. Kasparov consciously went for it, and further events developed as follows. Knight c6, white castles. Magnus plays knight h5. He wants to move the knight to f4, queen to g5. In the king's Indian defense, black mostly attacks on the king side. So here Magnus somehow tries to organize an attack on the king. Kasparov plays queen d2 to keep the knight off f4 and to connect the rooks. Bishop e5, g3. Garry Kasparov severely restricts all offensive attempts from Magnus. He won't let anybody in. The queen to h4, the knight and bishop to f4. He blocks them all. But Garry allowed the move bishop h3, which, by the way, is not quite accurate. Rather, he should have played knight g7 to somehow activate the knight. The knight on the edge of the board has a bad position. From here you can move it to f5 and so on. The bishop h3 is useless here. The rook gets chased away to the square it wanted to go. Rook e1 is a great move. The rook stands great here on the open file, and the h3 bishop is quite off. Knight g7. Now Magnus realizes that it's time to bring the knight into play. Rook d1. Kasparov plays very solid. Rook c8. This move is also not the most accurate. It was better to play bishop e6 to strengthen the pawn on d5, return the bishop to a good position in advance, and rook c8. It's such a general move, you know? What is it doing here? It's not quite clear. Maybe it wants to attack the c5 pawn, but here the f2 bishop defends it, so it's not quite clear what the exact point of the move is. Knight b5 plays Kasparov. He already attacks the d5 pawn. a6 follows, and knight d6. Great resource. He exchanges black's strong bishop, and Magnus plays d4. If he had played queen d6, the knight would have taken d5, and then he could have played g4, limiting the bishop. Plus, there's a threat of invasion on f6. So white has quite a big advantage here, since black has no bishop. So Kasparov has the advantage. Magnus plays d4 in the hope of exchanging white's bishop. If they had taken d4, the long-awaited exchange would have happened. Here black can immediately capture d4, but this option is connected with a d6 pawn sacrifice. Or they can take the d6 pawn. Well, in general, there are some counter chances for black. Of course, white has the advantage because he can move the bishop, for example, to b6 to take control of d8. Anyway, d4 is an interesting move, but Kasparov doesn't get tempted by that pawn, so he plays knight e4. He protects his pawn on d6, plus wants to move his knight to f6. Bishop f5 is played by Magnus. And now, friends, on the 22nd move, you have to find a very strong solution for Garry Kasparov, as a result of which he just gets extra material. Pause the video and find a winning solution for Garry Kasparov. Well, I hope you were able to find this solution. It's move d7, landing a fork to these two rooks. The thing is that if you take this pawn with queen, the knight f6 fork will follow. So it's better to take it with bishop like Magnus did. In that case, bishop hits d4, knight f6 is threatening, bishop hits g7 with further capture of the d7 bishop. That's a lot of threats for white. The position is difficult for Magnus. He plays knight d4. However, if he plays rook e4 and tries to sacrifice an exchange, the position is not good either. Black may have resisted longer here, but Kasparov would still win in the end. Knight d4 followed, queen d4, bishop hangs, knight f6 fork threatens. Knight f5 played by Magnus, queen d7, just gave up a piece. But here, as you understand, the game was not very interesting without a piece, and Kasparov implemented everything perfectly. Bishop c4, rook e3. He defended against all possible threats, and Magnus Carlsen admitted his defeat in this position because he's simply down a bishop. So friends, these were the two games in which Garry Kasparov defeated the young Magnus Carlsen. But as you already understood, the main game was exactly the one in which Magnus managed to make a draw with Kasparov, and from the position of strength. That game had a big impact on Magnus Carlsen's fate. Kasparov was so impressed with his performance that he even came to visit Magnus later to talk and train him. Everyone immediately started talking about Magnus. He got sponsors, so he became a world star. If you look at Magnus's rating, in January 2004 he had a rating of 2,484. The game against Kasparov was played in March, and you can see the sharp increase in his rating. Because he immediately had sponsors, extra coaches, and support, over the course of 4 years he achieved a rating of 2,800. At the age of 18, he already had a rating of almost 2,800. If you take Sergei Karyakin, for example, in January of 2004 he was rated 2,566. That's almost 100 points more than Magnus, and they're the same age. But Karyakin never proved himself and didn't play a big tournament where he could have made a draw with Kasparov or beat Karpov. So he was growing quite well too, but not as fast as Magnus. He had a rating of 2,700 in 2008, and Magnus's is almost 2,800, so they were practically on a par with each other, but Magnus accelerated at that time. And then you know what happened, friends. And I thank you for your attention, friends. Give this video a like if you like the way Kasparov defeated the young Magnus Carlsen. Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to keep up to date with all our latest videos. Also, check out our Telegram channel and Instagram, where we post only the latest news in the world of chess. Keep playing and studying chess, and I'll see you soon.